7 words can detonate a life if they're spoken at the wrong moment by the wrong person. Can I sleep with you? He locked the door. Those words reached me at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, trembling through the speaker of my phone like a confession, and a plea wrapped into one. And in that instant, everything I thought I knew about restraint, timing, and survival shattered. I'm Paul Everett. I'm 29 years old, and for more than half my life, I've been quietly, stupidly, relentlessly in love with Pamela Foster. 13 years of wanting someone you're not. Allowed to want does something to a person. It hollows you out, teaches you patience you never asked for, turns hope into something you keep folded away like a letter you're afraid to reread. She was my little sister Sarah's best friend first, untouchable by every rule that mattered when I was 16 and trying to pretend I didn't notice. The way Pam laughed with her whole body, or how sunlight caught in her hair like it was trying to stay there. Later, she was the woman who slipped through my hands in the rain outside a church 3 years ago when my sister's funeral ended and grief blurred everything, and we stood too close for two, long until she pulled away and left me wondering if I'd imagined the electricity between us. After that, she became a ghost, the kind that doesn't haunt houses but lives in the quiet moments of your life, in empty rooms and unfinished conversations, while she built a future with another man. So when she called me that night, crying so hard I could barely understand her, fear slicing through every word, there was no room for hesitation. There's still room at my place, I said, my hand already closing around my keys, because the room I was offering her wasn't just a couch or a spare bed. It was the space I'd kept open in my chest since the day we met, the one I'd never let anyone else touch, the place where every unspoken I love you still lived, patient and bruised but alive. When I pulled up to that neat suburban street and saw her under the streetlight, coatless, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together, something inside me split clean open. She looked smaller than I remembered, folded inward, and when she stumbled toward my truck and collapsed into my arms, it felt like muscle memory finally fulfilling its purpose. Even shaking, even sobbing, even terrified, she fit against me like she'd always belonged there. "You came," she whispered, disbelief tangled with relief, and I could feel her heart racing through my jacket, smell her shampoo mixed with salt and panic, feel 13 years of longing surge through my veins as I held her, tighter than I'd ever held anything. The drive back to my place felt unreal, like we were moving through thick water. Red lights stretched forever. Every turn pulled us farther from the life she'd known and closer to mine. She sat curled into the passenger seat, clutching a phone with a spider-webbed screen, staring out the window as if she needed to memorize the streets in case she never saw them again. I wanted to ask everything. About Marcus. About the bruises blooming on her wrist when her sleeve slipped. About why tonight was the night she finally ran. But her breathing was still uneven, her hands still trembling. And I knew the only thing that mattered right then was that she felt safe. My house came into view, small and weathered, porch sagging slightly, hedges overgrown in the way that happens when one person lives alone and stops caring what things look like from the outside. She studied it for a moment, then something in her expression softened. "This is Uncle Ray's place," she said quietly. "Sarah used to talk about staying here. She said it felt like home." Hearing my sister's name tightened my throat. "Her room's still the same," I said. "I never changed it. You can stay there if you want." Pamela turned to me then, really looked at me, and in the dim dashboard light I saw tears gather again. "You kept it?" she whispered. I nodded because words weren't cooperating. We sat there in the cooling dark, the engine ticking, both of us knowing that once we crossed that threshold, nothing between us would ever be neutral again. Finally, she reached over and took my hand, her fingers icy but determined. "Thank you for coming, Paul. After everything, I didn't think I deserved it." "You always deserve better," I told her softly. "Always." Inside, the house smelled like coffee and old wood and the faint mustiness of solitude. I flipped on lights as we moved through. The living room with its worn couch and half-watched television, past the kitchen where my morning dishes still dried in the rack, past my work boots by the door and the high-vis vest slung over a chair. Everything about the place screamed bachelor and stalled time, but Pamela didn't comment. She followed me down the narrow hallway until I stopped at the second bedroom. My hand lingered on the knob. I hadn't opened that door in weeks. Maybe longer. Might smell a little stale, I said, then pushed it open. The room was frozen exactly as Sarah had left it. Band posters layered the walls, fantasy novels crammed into shelves, their spines broken from love. A purple comforter lay neatly across the bed, untouched since the day. I'd smoothed it down in a fit of grief and never disturbed it again. Her acoustic guitar leaned in the corner, stickered with memories. Fairy lights still traced the ceiling, stubbornly glowing. Pamela stood in the doorway, hand over her mouth, tears spilling freely. "Oh my God," she breathed. "It's the same." Exactly the same. She stepped inside like she was entering a church, fingers brushing the books. "We used to lie on this bed for hours," she said, voice breaking, talking about everything. She'd make me sing even though I can't. She was my best friend. Losing her broke something in me, and I think that's why I let Marcus in. I was so empty. I stayed in the doorway, every instinct screaming to hold her, but giving her the space she needed. "Sarah loved you like a sister," I said. "She was so proud of you." Pamela turned, eyes raw. "I gave up everything, Paul. My job, my apartment, my friends." I disappeared. And I didn't even see it happening. She sat on the bed, gripping the comforter. "It started small," she continued. "Questions, then control, then fear. Tonight, when I tried to leave, he threw my phone and locked me out. I stood there for 20 minutes, not knowing who to call. And then I thought of you, of how safe I felt in your arms. And you came." I crossed the room and sat on the floor beside the bed, back against Sarah's desk. "I'll always come," I said. She looked at me with something fragile and hopeful. "Can I tell you something? At the funeral, I almost kissed you. I wanted to so badly it hurt, but I was scared. And then I chose him. I chose wrong. The truth hit me like a wave. I wanted you to kiss me too," I admitted. "Since I was 16. Since the yellow sundress. I never stopped." The silence between us was thick with years. She slid down beside me, shoulder to mine, resting her head there without a word. Later, when fear crept back into her voice, I told her she wasn't broken, only hurt. When she asked if I could stay, I did. I sat there while she slept, telling stories about Sarah under the fairy lights, realizing for the first time that I was finally taking the chance my sister always said I should. Morning came with coffee and cinnamon. Pamela at my stove, wearing Sarah's shirt and my sweatpants, smiling like it was allowed again. But fear followed the light. "Missed calls!" Marcus's name buzzing on the counter. "He'll come," she said. "Then we'll handle it," I told her. Together. When the knock finally came, loud and demanding, I stepped between her and the door. Marcus stood outside, polished and cold, charm stretched thin. Pamela found her voice anyway. "I'm done." The next day, with Big Mike at our side, we went to get her things. What we found were cut clothes and destroyed memories. And something in Pamela snapped into place. She chose herself. She chose me. She walked out without looking back. Weeks passed. A restraining order, healing in inches, laughter returning. Love growing careful and real. When she finally kissed me, it was unplanned and perfect. We took it slow. And one snowy night, wrapped together on the porch, she told me she chose me not because she needed saving, but because she wanted me. When she asked if Sarah would be happy, I knew the answer. Yes. Absolutely yes. And inside that small house on the edge of Ohio, two people who'd loved each other silently. For years, finally learned how to love out loud. The first night after the restraining order came through, the house felt different in a way I couldn't quite explain. Not lighter exactly, but steadier. Like something that had been rattling in the walls for years had finally settled. Pamela was still sleeping in Sarah's room then, not because she had to, but because she said it helped her breathe at night. I didn't argue. Healing doesn't follow logic. And I'd learned quickly that my job wasn't to fix her pace, just to walk beside it. Some evenings she was almost buoyant, laughing too loudly at bad TV shows, insisting on cooking dinner even though she burned the rice twice. Other nights she went quiet, staring at nothing, her fingers worrying the hem of whatever shirt she wore like she was afraid it might disappear. I learned to recognize the signs. When she needed space, I gave it. When she needed reassurance, I stayed close. When nightmares dragged her out of sleep, she'd appear in my doorway without a word, eyes glassy, and I'd pull back the covers and let her curl against me until her breathing evened out again. Marcus tried once more after the order, a brief, Desperate violation that ended quickly when the cops showed up at the flower shop. After that, he vanished from our daily reality, but the echo of him lingered. Trauma has a way of replaying itself when the threat is gone, like the body finally feels safe enough to remember. Pamela started therapy twice a week. She came home from sessions exhausted but lighter, like she'd set down a heavy bag she'd been carrying without realizing it. She talked more about Sarah then, about the plans they'd made, the trips they never took. Sometimes she cried mid-sentence and apologized automatically, and every time I told her the same thing. You don't have to be sorry for feeling things here. This house can handle it. I can handle it. I didn't realize how much I'd been holding myself apart from life until she moved in. My routines had been precise and narrow. Work, groceries, sleep, repeat. Now there were shared breakfasts, grocery lists written in 2 different handwritings, her books creeping onto every flat surface. She rearranged my kitchen cabinets one afternoon without asking, then froze like she'd done something unforgivable when I walked in. I just laughed and said it made more sense this way. She stared at me for a long second like she was trying to memorize the moment, then smiled so softly it almost hurt to see. The first time she came to one of my shifts with homemade cookies for the crew, Big Mike raised an eyebrow and said, "About time, kid." Maria hugged her like she'd known her forever. Pamela glowed for the rest of the night, like she'd been welcomed back into the world. We talked a lot, sometimes late into the night, sometimes over coffee at the table while rain streaked the windows. About what happened, about what we wanted, about what scared us. I told her things I'd never said out loud before, about how lonely it had been loving her quietly for so long, about the guilt I carried for not protecting Sarah more. Even though I knew it wasn't logical, Pamela listened like every word mattered. She never minimized it. She never rushed me. When I admitted that part of me still worried she'd wake up one day and realize she'd settled, she reached across the table, took my hand and said, "I don't feel like I'm settling. I feel like I finally stopped running." That sentence lived in my chest for weeks. The move from Sarah's room to mine happened gradually, without ceremony. One night she fell asleep on my bed while we were talking, exhaustion finally winning. The next morning she joked that she might as well stay since she'd already drooled on my pillow. By the end of the week, her clothes were in my dresser, her toothbrush beside mine, her presence woven so naturally into my space that it felt strange to remember the house without her. We were careful with intimacy, letting it grow organically, never pushing past what felt right. When we finally made love, it wasn't fireworks or desperation. It was quiet and reverent and full of pauses, like we were both aware of how much history sat between us. Afterwards, she cried, not from fear but from relief, and held me like she was afraid I might vanish. I stayed awake long after she fell asleep, listening to her breathe, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of her being there. There were setbacks. A loud argument outside the grocery store sent her into a panic, so sharp she dropped her bags and crouched between cars, hands over her ears. I knelt beside her in the asphalt, ignoring the stairs, talking her through it until she could stand again. She hated those moments, hated feeling like she'd lost ground, and every time I reminded her that healing wasn't a straight line. Some days she believed me, some days she didn't. On the days she didn't, I believed for both of us. Winter deepened. Snow piled against the porch railings, muffling the neighborhood. We developed rituals, Friday diner nights, Sunday morning pancakes, evening walks bundled in layers, our breath fogging the air. She started playing Sarah's guitar again, filling the house with music that felt like a blessing. One night she sang softly while I cooked, and I had to step into the pantry. For a second, because the weight of gratitude in my chest threatened to knock me over. Loving someone like this, out in the open, felt almost frightening in its intensity, but it also felt right in a way nothing else ever had. One evening, months after that first call, we sat on the couch watching a movie neither of us was really paying attention to. Pamela traced idle patterns on my arm, then grew still. "Paul," she said quietly, "if I ever get scared again, if I ever doubt myself, will you remind me who I was before him?" I turned to face her, cupping her cheek. "I'll remind you every day if you need me to. And if you forget, I'll remember for you until you don't anymore." She leaned into my hand, eyes shining, and whispered, "I love you." The words didn't feel heavy or urgent. They felt settled, earned. "I love you too," I said. And for the first time in my life, The future didn't feel like something happening somewhere else. By spring, the house no longer felt like a refuge from a storm. It felt like a starting point. Pamela talked about school again, about finishing the degree she'd abandoned. She talked about traveling, about possibilities. Sometimes she caught herself mid-dream and went quiet, like she was waiting for permission to want things again. Every time, I gave it without hesitation. We'll figure it out. Whatever you want, we'll make room for it. The phrase became ours, a quiet promise threaded through everything we did. One afternoon, she stood in Sarah's old room, looking around thoughtfully. "We should do something with this space," she said. "Not erase her, just let it breathe." Together, we packed up posters, dusted shelves, moved furniture. We kept the guitar out, the fairy lights, the things that mattered. When we were done, the room felt lighter, still full of memory but no longer frozen in grief. Pamela squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for trusting me with this." "Thank you for trusting me," I replied. Life didn't become perfect. We still argued about stupid things. Money got tight. My furnace finally died and we spent a week, bundled in blankets, waiting for a replacement. But we faced it all side by side, and that made the difference. One night, as we lay tangled together, she murmured into the dark, "I used to think love was about being chosen by someone powerful. Now I know it's about choosing each other when things are quiet and hard and real." I kissed her forehead, thinking of the boy I'd been at 16, watching a girl in a yellow sundress and never imagining he'd get this ending. If Sarah could see us, I knew she'd smile that crooked smile and say she'd told me. So, time has a strange way of stretching and folding when you finally feel safe. Weeks turned into months without announcing themselves, marked not by dates on a calendar, but by small victories that would have gone unnoticed in another life. Pamela sleeping through the night without waking in a panic. Pamela laughing when something startled her instead of freezing. Pamela standing a little straighter when she talked about her past, as if it belonged to her again instead of looming over her shoulder. I watched these changes quietly, careful not to rush them, aware that healing is a skittish thing that bolts if you stare at it too hard. I learned to measure progress in breaths and glances, in how easily she reached for my hand in public, in how she stopped checking the locks twice before bed. Spring crept in slowly, thawing the edges of winter and softening the house. The porch stopped groaning under the weight of snow and started collecting pollen instead. We painted the living room one Saturday, choosing a warm neutral that made the space feel less like a holding pattern and more like a home. Pamela got paint in her hair and laughed when I tried to wipe it off and only made it worse. For a moment, watching her like that, carefree and unguarded, I felt something close to grief for all the years she'd lost. Then I reminded myself that this was the point, not to mourn what couldn't be changed, but to protect what was finally happening. She went back to the library part-time first, easing into it like she was testing cold water with her toes. The familiar rhythm seemed to anchor her. She came home smelling like old books and dust, telling me about patrons who argued over late fees and kids who fell asleep in the reading nook. One night she set her bag down and said, almost casually, "I'm thinking about enrolling again, finishing my degree." The way she said it, tentative but hopeful, made my chest ache. I told her I thought it was a great idea, that we'd make it work. She studied my face, searching for doubt. And when she didn't find it, she nodded like she'd just crossed an invisible line. Marcus surfaced again only in echoes. A mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing him downtown with someone new, arm draped possessively over her shoulders, and Pamela went quiet for the rest of the night. She didn't spiral the way she used to. Instead, she sat with the feeling, let it pass through her. Later, she told me she felt sad for the woman, not jealous. That was when I knew something fundamental had shifted. Power like his only works when it's fed by fear. Pamela had starved it. One evening, after a long shift, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, college forms, financial aid applications, a spreadsheet she'd color-coded. She looked up at me, eyes bright and nervous. "I think I can do this," she said. "I think I can really do this." I crossed the room and kissed her forehead. "You can, and you will." She exhaled, a sound halfway between laughter and relief, and leaned into me like she always did when she needed grounding. We talked about the future more openly then, not in grand declarations, but in practical conversations that carried real weight. Budgets, schedules, what? We wanted our lives to look like 5 years down the road. I admitted I'd thought about going back to school myself, Maybe moving up from supervising nights at the warehouse into logistics management. Pamela encouraged me in a way no one ever had, asking questions, helping me research programs, making it feel possible instead of foolish. It struck me how naturally we fell into partnership, how balanced it felt. We took turns being strong. We took turns being scared. There were still moments when the past reached out unexpectedly. A slammed door from a neighbor's house sent Pamela retreating into herself. A raised voice on the TV made her flinch before she caught herself. Each time we worked through it together, she'd name what she was feeling. I'd listen, no fixing, no minimizing, just presence. Over time, the moments came less often. When they did, they passed faster. The body, it turns out, learned safety the same way it learned fear, through repetition. One night in early summer, we went to a small outdoor concert in the park, the kind Sarah would have loved. Local bands, folding chairs, kids running barefoot in the grass. Pamela hesitated at the edge of the crowd, fingers curling into my shirt. "We can leave," I said immediately. She shook her head. "No, I want to stay. I want to try." We found a spot near the back, close to an exit. As the music started, she relaxed inch by inch, eventually swaying gently, her head resting against my shoulder. When she turned to smile up at me, eyes shining in the stage lights, something fierce and protective rose in my chest. This was what showing up looked like. Not grand gestures, just staying. Later that night, lying in bed with the windows open and the sounds of summer drifting in, Pamela traced the scar on my forearm from a long-ago workplace accident. "You never told me how you got this," she said. I shrugged. "Forklift mishap?" I was tired. Not paying attention. She frowned slightly. "You take care of everyone else. You should take care of yourself, too." The concern in her voice was gentle but firm, and it dawned on me that this was new for me as well. Being seen, being cared for without having to earn it. I promised her I would try. She smiled and kissed the scar like it was a pact. As the anniversary of Sarah's death approached, the house grew quieter. Grief doesn't disappear, it waits. Pamela asked me one afternoon if we could do something together that day. Something intentional. We drove out to the lake where Sarah used to skip stones. Sat on the dock with our feet dangling in the water. Pamela brought the guitar and played softly, a song Sarah loved. I told stories, ones Pamela hadn't heard yet, about growing up, about my sister's stubbornness and kindness. We cried, we laughed. When we left, it felt like we'd honored her instead of just surviving the memory. On the drive home, Pamela reached for my hand and squeezed it. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," she said. "You already are," I replied. "You always have been." By late summer, the house on the edge of town looked different from the outside, too. The porch had been repaired. The hedges trimmed. A couple of potted plants appeared. Then a small herb garden out back that Pamela tended with quiet pride. Neighbors started waving. It was subtle, but it mattered. For so long, the house had been a place I returned to, not one I lived in. Now it felt inhabited, alive. One evening, after a long day of errands and laughter, we collapsed on the couch, tired and content. Pamela rested her head on my chest, listening to my heartbeat. "Do you ever worry this is too good to last?" she asked softly. I considered the question. The old fear that happiness was something you borrowed until it was taken back. Sometimes, I admitted. But then I remember that we're not waiting for something to happen to us. We're building this. She nodded, thoughtful. I like that. I like choosing this every day. The fear didn't vanish overnight, but it changed shape. It became less about losing each other and more about how to protect what we'd grown. We learned how to argue without tearing things down, how to pause when emotions ran high. Once, during a tense discussion about money, Pamela raised her voice and immediately froze, eyes wide with terror, bracing for consequences that never came. I took her hands, grounded her, reminded her where she was. She cried afterward, not from pain, but from the realization that conflict didn't have to mean danger. That moment mattered more than 100 easy days. As fall edged closer again, the same season that had once delivered her to my doorstep in pieces, I noticed how different everything felt. The memory of that night no longer hurt the way it used to. It had transformed into something else. A turning point. Pamela noticed it too. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching leaves skitter across the yard, she said, "I used to think that night defined me by what was done to me. Now I think it defines me by what I chose after." I chose to leave. I chose to call you. I chose to stay. I chose to heal. I squeezed her hand, overwhelmed by the strength in her words. You did that, I said. I just opened the door. She smiled, that soft, steady smile that had become my favorite sight in the world. And in that moment, watching the sun dip low and the house glow with warm light behind us, I understood something I hadn't before. Love wasn't the dramatic rescue I'd imagined as a younger man. It was quieter, more demanding. It asked you to be present, patient, honest. It asked you to keep room, even when you didn't know if anyone would ever fill it. And when someone finally did, it asked you to keep choosing them, long after the crisis passed. That night, as we went inside and locked the door behind us, Pamela paused, resting her hand on the frame. Thank you, she said again, like the words were a touchstone, for having room, for not closing it when it would have been easier. I wrapped my arms around her, breathing her in, feeling the solidity of the life we were building. There's always room, I told her. For you, always.